Dawn breaks along the Nile, not with the glint of royal gold, but the heavy scent of baking emmer wheat and the cool stick of river mud, while the stone peaks behind us were chiseled for eternity.
The souls who labored here lived in the fleeting, vibrant grit of the everyday.
This is somnolent. We are stripping away the pharaoh's gold to reveal the blood.
Grit and joy of the forgotten 99%.
To understand that grit, you must first look at the ground beneath a commoner's feet. For a person living in the shadow of the pyramids, the world was divided into two uncompromising colors, the black and the red. The black land, which they called Kemet, was the only world that mattered. It was the narrow strip of soil along the riverbanks, rich with a thick, dark silt that felt like velvet between the toes and smelled of ancient, decaying vegetation. This was the source of all life, a fertile gift delivered annually by a god they could not see, but whose heartbeat they felt in every rising tide. But walk just a few hundred yards away from the water's reach, and the black earth ended as abruptly as if a knife had cut the landscape. Beyond lay the Deshret, the Red Land.
This was a scorched, unforgiving wilderness of sand and rock, where the sun reigned as a tyrant. To the commoner, the Red Land was the home of chaos and the restless dead. It was a place where life went to vanish, making the fragile green ribbon of the Nile Valley feel like the only safe room in a house surrounded by fire. This precarious existence was governed not by the whim of a king, but by the movement of the water. Life was a sequence of 3 acts, a biological clock that dictated when you slept, when you ate, and when you labored. It began with Akhet, the season of the inundation. Every year, as the dog star Sirius appeared on the horizon, the Nile would begin to swell, turning the valley into a vast mirror-like lake. For a farmer, this was a time of forced stillness.
You sat on the higher ground, watching your fields disappear under several feet of murky water. You didn't despair. You waited. You watched the watermarks on the stone quays with a bated breath, knowing that if the flood was too low, the land would starve, and if it was too high, your mud brick home would dissolve back into the earth. When the water finally receded, it left behind a fresh layer of that black, greasy mud, and the season of Peret began. This was the time of the emergence, the frantic window where every man, woman, and child worked the soil while it was still soft, casting seeds of emmer wheat and barley into the damp earth before the sun could bake it hard. Finally came Shemu, the season of the harvest and the low water.
This was the time of heat and heavy labor, where the physical toll of life became an inescapable reality. But why did they do it? Why did they surrender so much of their hard-earned grain to the local tax collectors and the granaries of the pharaoh? The answer lay in a concept that sat at the very center of their soul: ma'at. To a modern ear, ma'at sounds like a dry legal term, often translated as justice or truth. But to an Egyptian farmer, ma'at was the glue of the universe. It was the belief that the world was a delicate mechanism of balance. If the farmer did his work, if the scribe recorded the yields, and if the pharaoh performed the sacred rituals in the temples, then the sun would continue to rise and the Nile would continue to flood.
Payment of taxes was not viewed as a loss, but as a spiritual insurance policy. You gave up your grain to the state because that grain fueled the temples and the rituals that kept the cosmos from collapsing into the chaos of the Red Land. To defy the hierarchy was to invite disaster, not just for yourself, but for the entire world. When you stood in the sun, sweat stinging your eyes as you hauled baskets of grain, you weren't just a laborer. You were a guardian of the cosmic order. The hierarchy was as natural as the seasons themselves. The king was the peak of the pyramid, the point where the divine touched the earth, but the commoner was the foundation. Without the silent, rhythmic toil of the 99%, the bridge between heaven and earth would shatter, and the black land would be swallowed by the red forever. Every swing of the hoe was an act of preservation, a small, dusty prayer to keep the world turning for one more day. This rhythm of the hoe was not an isolated dance. It was the foundational heartbeat of a machine far greater than any single man. If the Black Land was the physical body of Egypt, then its social structure was the skeleton, rigid and unyielding. To understand the commoner, one must understand the geometry of his world, not just the squares of his fields, but the invisible lines of the social pyramid that defined every breath he took. This structure was as permanent as the limestone blocks of the high plateau, providing a sense of stability in a world where the river could be fickle and the sun could be cruel. At the top sat the pharaoh, a god walking among men, but beneath that singular peak, the weight of the empire was distributed through a complex web of status and duty that ensured no person was ever truly alone, yet no person was ever truly free. To find the greatest contrast to the field hand, one need only look at the man sitting in the shade of a temple portico, clutching a reed brush and a wooden pallet. The scribe was the elite's quiet engine, a figure of prestige who moved through the world without ever breaking a sweat. While the laborer's skin was baked dark and his joints were swollen from the repetitive strain of the harvest, the scribe's hands were soft, marked only by the stains of black and red pigments.
To be a scribe was to possess the magic of literacy, the ability to freeze spoken words into stone and papyrus. They were the accountants of the gods, recording every bushel of grain, every head of cattle, and every hour of labor owed to the state. To the laborer, the scribe was a figure of distant authority, a man who could change a family's fortune with a single stroke of a pen, or demand a tax that would leave a household hungry through the winter. This was the divide between the muscle of Egypt and its memory, a gap bridged only by the shared language of the Nile. Within the confines of the village, however, the hierarchy became more tangible and immediate. The grand designs of the state were filtered through the local overseer, a man who functioned as the village's primary point of friction.
He was the one who walked the rows of crops with a measuring cord, his eyes always scanning for laziness or theft. He represented the demand of the crown, the constant pressure to produce more than what was needed for survival. Yet, balanced against the overseer's stern presence was the village priest. This was not always a man of high rank, but he was essential. He lived among the people, overseeing the small shrines where the commoners brought their modest offerings of bread and beer. The priest ensured that the local spirits were appeased and that the rituals of purification were observed, acting as the spiritual glue that held the community together when the physical world became too difficult to bear. Then there was the family unit, the foundational stone upon which the entire pyramid rested. In the small mud-brick dwellings that clustered near the fields, life was a shared struggle. The house was a place of constant motion. While the men were in the fields, the women were the masters of the household economy, grinding grain into flour, brewing the thick beer that served as a primary source of nutrition, and weaving the linen that clothed the village. Children were not merely offspring, they were apprentices to the survival of the lineage. From a young age, they learned the specific movements of their parents, ensuring that one generation faded into the western horizon of death, another was ready to take up the tools of the trade. One might ask why this rigid system, which demanded so much from the many to benefit the few, persisted for thousands of years without the fires of rebellion. The answer lies in Ma'at, the ancient concept of cosmic balance. To the Egyptian mind, the hierarchy was not a cage, it was the natural order of the universe. Just as the sun must rise and the Nile must flood, the scribe must write, the overseer must watch, and the laborer must dig. To step out of one's place was to invite the terrifying shadow of chaos that would swallow the world. By accepting their station, the commoners believed they were doing something far greater than just surviving. They were participating in the maintenance of the universe. Every basket of dirt carried and every seed planted was a contribution to a divine equilibrium that kept the darkness at bay. They were the silent architects of stability, finding meaning in the knowledge that their specific, humble task was the only thing preventing the world from falling into pieces.
As the sun begins to climb higher, the theory of the pyramid fades, replaced by the crushing reality of the work it demands. That reality begins not at the base of a limestone monument, but within the cramped, dust-filled confines of a home made from the very earth the Nile provides. Long before the first heavy stones are hauled across the plateau, the morning starts in silence on the flat, rectangular roof of a mud brick house. In the workers' village, the roof is more than a ceiling. It is the primary bedroom for the entire family. During the stifling Egyptian nights, the thick walls of the rooms below trap the remnants of the previous day's heat, making the interior feel like a cooling kiln. Up here, under the fading stars, a slight breeze usually rolls in from the river, offering the only true rest a laborer will find. As the horizon turns from a bruised purple to a pale, dusty gold, the household begins to stir.
There is no furniture to climb out of. The concept of a bed frame or a mattress is a luxury reserved for those who will never blister their hands. For the commoner, sleep happens on a thin mat of woven reeds or palm fibers, perhaps padded with a layer of coarse linen. When you wake, you simply stand up. There are no chairs to sit in while you gather your thoughts, no tables to lean on. Life happens on the floor. Descending a narrow, steep mud staircase, the transition from the open air of the roof to the ground floor is a physical blow of sensory information. The temperature drops immediately, the thick mud brick acting as a primitive but effective air conditioner. The air is heavy with the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the pungent, musky odor of livestock. In a house that might only span 400 square feet, space is a concept rather than a reality. You are never alone. You navigate through a crowd of sleeping children, aging parents, and perhaps a brother's family, all sharing the same 3 or 4 rooms. The architecture is a direct response to the sun. The windows are nothing more than tiny, high-set slits in the walls, designed to let a sliver of light in while keeping the furnace of the Sahara out. This creates a perpetual twilight inside, where the walls are plastered with a rough coat of grayish-white lime or left as raw, brown mud. In the corners, large ceramic jars stand half buried in the dirt floor to keep water and grain as cool as possible. There are no closets. Clothing and the few precious tools of the trade are kept in woven baskets or simple wooden chests tucked against the base of the walls. Before the day truly starts, there is the ritual of the body. In a world of dust and sweat, hygiene is not about vanity. It is a matter of survival and social standing. Even the poorest laborer attempts to start the day clean. You see the man of the house crouching in the dim light, using a small polished copper razor. There is no lather, only water and perhaps a bit of oil to soften the skin. Every hair on the head and face is scraped away. In the intense heat of the valley, hair is an invitation for lice and skin infections. A bald head and a smooth chin are the marks of a civilized person, a way to separate oneself from the wild animals and the unkempt foreigners beyond the borders. Beside him, his wife might be preparing a mixture of natron, a naturally occurring salt, and crushed limestone to use as a scrub. It is abrasive and harsh, but it cuts through the grease and grime of a day's labor. Once the skin is scrubbed raw, the most vital element of the morning routine is applied: oil. He reaches for a small chipped ceramic jar, pouring a thick, yellowish ribbon of castor oil or linseed oil into his palm. It is heavy and pungent, but it is the only barrier between his skin and the unforgiving sun. Without this daily anointing, the skin would crack, bleed, and fester under the weight of the limestone dust at the construction site. The house is a living, breathing entity, and its layout follows a strict functional logic. Moving from the front door, you pass through a small vestibule into the central room. This is the heart of the home, often featuring a single wooden pillar or a mud brick column painted to resemble a lotus, supporting the heavy roof. This is where the head of the household would sit on a low mud platform to receive guests or settle family disputes. But at this hour, it is a transit zone for children dodging the goats or geese that are kept inside the house overnight to protect them from predators and thieves. The animals are the family's walking bank account, and their presence is felt in the layer of straw and dung that must be swept out every single morning.
Beyond the central room lies the kitchen, which is usually the only part of the house without a permanent roof. This allows the caustic smoke from the dung-fired hearth to escape into the sky. Here, the sensory reality of the morning reaches its peak. The rhythmic grating sound of the saddle quern fills the air as the women of the house kneel on the ground, pushing a heavy stone back and forth to grind emmer wheat into flour. It is back-breaking work that begins hours before the sun is high. The smell of souring beer mash and the earthy aroma of flatbread baking on hot stones compete with the lingering scent of the animals. There is no privacy here. No doors separate the rooms, only hanging mats of linen or beads. You hear every cough, every whisper, and every argument of your neighbors through the thin walls.
The village is a dense hive of shared existence. As the man finishes his oiling and picks up a simple linen loincloth, tying it tight around his waist, he is stepping out from this intimate, crowded world of family into the vast, impersonal world of the state. He leaves behind the smell of his wife's cooking and the warmth of his children's breath to face the cold stone of the plateau. The transition is now complete. The domestic sphere, with its cooling mud and its familiar rhythms, is left in the shadow of the rising sun. He walks out the narrow doorway, his bare feet hitting the packed dirt of the street, joining a stream of other men emerging from identical doors. Together, they move toward the horizon, where the theory of the pyramid is waiting to become the reality of their day. The dust kicks up under 1,000 pairs of calloused feet, but before the first copper chisel strikes the limestone, another industry has already been churning for hours. Back in the shadows of the mud-brick dwellings, the sound of the morning is not the clink of stone, but the rhythmic, heavy scraping of grain against granite. This is the heartbeat of the Egyptian economy, a system where wealth is not held in a purse, but baked in an oven and brewed in a vat. To understand the pyramid, one must first understand the emmer wheat and the barley. For the commoner, life is a constant calculation of energy spent versus energy consumed. Inside the cramped courtyards of the workers' village, the air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and the fine, golden powder of pulverized husks.
A woman kneels over a saddle quern, her back arched, her weight shifting forward and back in a motion she will repeat for thousands of hours over the course of her life. She is grinding the grain into flour, a task that demands every ounce of her upper body strength. But as she works, the stone itself is a silent enemy. As the granite rubstones wear down from the friction, tiny, invisible shards of rock and wind-blown desert sand mingle with the flour. This is the hidden toll of the Nile. When we examine the skeletal remains of these laborers today, their teeth tell a story of constant, low-level agony. Their crowns are ground flat, worn down to the sensitive, raw pulp by a lifetime of chewing bread that was, quite literally, part stone.
Abscesses and bone infections were the silent companions of every meal, a physical price paid for the simple act of eating. Yet, there was no alternative. This grit-heavy bread, supplemented by thick, cloudy beer, formed the absolute foundation of human existence. In this world, the concept of a coin is non-existent. There is no silver to jingle in a pocket, no stamped gold to exchange for a favor. Instead, the economy functions on the fundamental reality of what a person can consume or use. When the workday ends and the sun begins its long descent toward the western cliffs, the foreman does not hand out a paycheck. He oversees the distribution of heavy sacks of grain and ceramic jars of beer. A common laborer might receive a standard ration of 10 loaves and a measure of beer daily, while an overseer or a skilled craftsman might receive double or triple that amount. This was not just a meal, it was currency. If a family needed a new pair of leather sandals or a sturdy wooden stool, they did not buy it with money, they traded their surplus grain for it. But how do you determine the value of a goat versus a pile of flax? To solve this, the Egyptians utilized a clever mental yardstick called the deben. A deben was a fixed unit of weight, usually about 91 grams of copper. While the copper itself rarely changed hands in a common transaction, Its weight served as a universal standard of value that everyone understood. Imagine a farmer bringing a basket of dried fish to the market.
He eyes a merchant who has a fine linen garment. They do not talk about prices in the way we do today. Instead, they argue and haggle by calculating how many deben of copper each item is worth. If they agree the fish are worth 5 deben and the linen is worth 5 deben, the trade is struck. It was a sophisticated system of bartering built on a phantom currency, a way to measure the world without the need for minted metal. The village market was a sensory overload of these calculations. You would see a woman offering a beautifully woven basket in exchange for a bundle of leeks and a jar of oil, their voices rising over the bleating of livestock and the heavy, salty scent of the fish stalls. Every exchange was a negotiation of survival.
The calories required to weave that basket, the hours of labor, the strain on the fingers, the food consumed while working, had to be balanced perfectly against the nutritional value of the goods received. It was an economy of pure physical effort. The beer they drank to wash down their coarse bread was far removed from the filtered, carbonated liquids of the modern world. It was a thick, nutritious gruel, rich in protein and vitamins, often strained through a reed cloth to remove the largest bits of fermented bread. Because it was brewed, it was safer to drink than the standing water of the canals, and provided the essential spike of carbohydrates needed to haul multi-ton blocks of stone under a punishing sun.
A man did not work for the glory of a god-king alone. He worked because the state provided the calories that kept his family from the brink of starvation. When we look at the sheer scale of the Giza Plateau, we often focus on the engineering or the geometry, but the true miracle was the logistics of the kitchen. Thousands of men required millions of loaves of bread and tens of thousands of gallons of beer every single week. This required a massive, centralized apparatus of state-run granaries and bakeries, a machine that transformed the silt of the Nile into the muscle of the workforce. Every stone set in place represents a specific number of baked loaves, a calculated expenditure of human energy fueled by the most recent harvest. The pyramid is, in a very real sense, a monument of solidified grain. It is a physical manifestation of the surplus wealth of the land, converted through human sweat into an eternal mountain of limestone. The transition from the field to the belly was a long, exhausting process that defined the daily rhythm of the commoner. From the sowing of the seed in the wake of the flood to the final, painful swallow of stone-flecked bread, the economy was not an abstract concept discussed by scholars in a palace. It was a physical weight carried in a basket, a burning sensation in a worn-down tooth, and the cool, yeasty relief of a jar of beer at the end of a 12-hour shift. As the men move into the shadow of the rising monument, they are already burning the fuel of their morning meal, their bodies beginning the daily, grueling conversion of bread into the legacy of an empire. While the heavy stone blocks define the landscape of the horizon, a different kind of architecture is being built within the mud brick walls of the village. The strength required to lift the empire's monuments is matched by the resilience of the household, a space where the Egyptian woman holds a position of authority that would baffle her contemporaries in other corners of the ancient world. Here, the sun warms the small courtyards where life is organized not by royal decree, but by the shared bonds of a partnership. Unlike the restrictive lives of women in later Greek or Roman societies, the woman of the Nile is an individual in her own right before the law. She walks the dusty streets not as a piece of property, but as a person who can own, inherit, and manage her own wealth. When a young couple decides to join their lives, there is no grand temple ceremony, no priest to bless the union with incense and prayers. Marriage is a pragmatic arrangement, a social contract rooted in the stability of the community. It begins when a woman moves her belongings into the house of her husband, often accompanied by a written document that outlines the protections afforded to her. These contracts are remarkably modern in their foresight. They detail the assets she brings into the union and ensure that, should the relationship fail, she retains her property. Love exists here, certainly,
captured in the lyrics of surviving poems that speak of the heart's longing. But the law focuses on the tangible. If the harmony of the home dissolves, the Egyptian woman possesses a power rarely seen in antiquity, the right to walk away.
Divorce is not a social catastrophe, but a recognized legal process. She can initiate it as easily as a man, citing neglect, incompatibility, or even the desire for a different life. In the eyes of the magistrate, her voice carries the same weight as any laborer or scribe. She can stand in court, testify, and demand the return of her dowry and a share of the assets they built together. This autonomy creates a society where the family unit is a choice rather than a prison, a partnership of necessity and mutual respect that forms the backbone of the Egyptian state. Within these homes, the roles are clearly defined yet complementary. While the man is often away, serving his turn in the labor gangs or working the fields, the woman manages the household economy.
She is the keeper of the stores, the producer of clothing, and the primary educator of the very young. This balance of power is visible in the small details of their daily existence, from the way they share meals to the way they are depicted in the modest art of their tombs, standing side by side, equals in the face of eternity. The ultimate goal of these unions is the continuation of the line, a vital pursuit in a world where life is often fleeting. But the joy of a new pregnancy is always shadowed by a quiet fear. In the dim light of the home, we see the true protectors of the family. These are not the great gods of the state like Ra or Osiris, but the intimate, protective spirits of the household.
A woman might wear a small faience amulet around her neck, perhaps the figure of Bes, the lion-featured dwarf whose fierce expression is meant to scare away evil spirits and protect the vulnerable during the night. He is the god of dance, music, and the protection of the innocent, a grotesque yet comforting presence in the corner of a bedroom. Beside him stands Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess with the swollen belly of an expectant mother. She is a fierce guardian of the birthing stool, possessing the strength of the river's most dangerous animal to ward off any harm that might come to the mother or the child. These amulets are not mere decorations. They are the medical and spiritual insurance of the commoner. They are clutched during the pains of labor and kept close to the cradle of the newborn. The danger is real and constant. In the absence of modern medicine, childbirth is the most perilous journey a woman will ever take. Mortality rates for both mother and infant are high, and every successful delivery is seen as a victory over the forces of chaos. Midwives, usually elderly women of the village who have witnessed hundreds of births, provide the practical knowledge, using flax bandages and honey-based salves. They understand the cycles of the body and the signs of a difficult arrival. When the first cry of a newborn finally cuts through the heat of the afternoon, it is a sound of triumph, a signal that the cycle of the Nile will continue for another generation. As children grow, their education takes place not in a formal schoolroom, but in the rhythm of daily work. For the majority of the population, literacy is a luxury they will never know.
Instead, their classroom is the field, the workshop, or the kitchen. A boy follows his father to the construction sites or the grain stores, learning the weight of the tools and the language of the trade through observation and repetition. He becomes an apprentice to the life he is destined to lead, learning how to judge the quality of a stone or the depth of a furrow. He learns that his survival depends on his ability to integrate into the collective effort of the village. A girl remains close to her mother, mastering the intricate arts of weaving, brewing, and managing the delicate economy of the household. She learns to grind emmer wheat into flour, to bake the heavy loaves that sustain her brothers and father, and to barter for goods in the local market.
By the age of 12 or 13, these children are no longer observers. They are active participants in the survival of their family. They have been molded by the practical needs of their environment, their hands toughened by the same tasks that occupied their ancestors for centuries. This passing of knowledge is the true engine of Egypt. It is a slow, steady transfer of skill that ensures the next generation can sustain the grandeur of the pharaohs. While the elite write their names in stone, the commoners write theirs in the blood and bone of their children. They teach them how to navigate the social hierarchies, how to respect the gods of the home, and how to survive in a land where the river gives and the desert takes away. This cycle of love, birth, and learning creates a social fabric as durable as the linen they weave, a quiet strength that supports the weight of the massive pyramids rising just beyond their doors. In the shadow of those monuments, the smallest acts of domestic life are the ones that truly ensure the empire's immortality.
While the farmer's life was dictated by the seasonal rhythm of the flood, another class of commoner lived by the rhythmic strike of the chisel against the mountain. To find them, we must travel away from the green silt of the riverbank and cross the Nile to the western shore, where the sun sets behind the jagged limestone cliffs of the Theban hills. Here, tucked into a natural amphitheater of rock, lies Deir el-Medina. Known to its inhabitants as Set Ma'at, the place of truth, this was no ordinary mud brick village. It was a gated community of specialists, the painters, draftsmen, and stonecutters who carved the eternal homes of the pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings. Unlike the silent millions who labored in the fields, the men of the place of truth were often literate. They were the elite of the common class, possessing skills that made them indispensable to the state. They spent their days in the dark, torch-lit chambers of the earth, breathing in limestone dust as they transformed cold rock into the vivid scenery of the afterlife. When they returned home at the end of their 10-day work week, they didn't just collapse into sleep, they wrote. They left behind thousands of ostraka, pieces of broken pottery and limestone chips that served as the scratch pads of antiquity. Through these fragments, we hear their voices with a clarity that the silent farmer can never provide. They wrote about legal disputes over borrowed donkeys, complaints about noisy neighbors, and even love poems. They were a community that understood the power of the written word, and more importantly, the power of their own labor. The life of an artisan was a delicate balance of privilege and dependency. They did not grow their own food. Instead, they were paid in kind by the royal granaries, monthly rations of emmer wheat for bread and barley for beer, supplemented by salt, fish, and vegetables. For centuries, this social contract held firm. The craftsman gave his talent and his time, and the pharaoh provided the sustenance. But in the mid-12th century before the Common Era, during the 29th year of the reign of Ramses III, the machinery of the state began to fracture. The empire was weary, drained by foreign wars and a bloated bureaucracy. Corruption had seeped into the local administration, and for the first time in memory, the grain ships did not arrive on schedule. The artisans waited. They watched the horizon for the supply barges while their granaries emptied and their children grew thin. The official response was silence and empty promises. To the administrators in the distant mortuary temples, these men were mere tools, expected to function regardless of the fuel provided. But the craftsmen of Deir el-Medina were not the unlettered peasants of the Delta. They knew their worth. They knew that without them, the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife would be stalled, his eternal house left unfinished, and his soul wandering in the dark. On a morning that would change the relationship between the ruler and the ruled forever, the artisans did something radical. They laid down their copper chisels. They put aside their brushes and their pigments. In an act of defiance that echoes through 3 millennia, they walked off the job. This was the first recorded labor strike in human history. They didn't just stop working, they marched. They left their walled village and crossed the hills, descending upon the great mortuary temples that served as the administrative hubs of the region. Imagine the shock of the temple priests and the government scribes as hundreds of dusty, sun-beaten men stood before the gates of the temple of Thutmose III. The artisans did not use violence, they used the weight of their presence. They sat down, they occupied the sacred ground and shouted their grievances for all to hear. Their cry was simple and haunting. "We are hungry. 18 days have passed in this month and we have received nothing. We have come here because of hunger and because of thirst. We have no clothes, no oil, no fish, no vegetables.
"Send to the Pharaoh, our good lord, and send to the vizier, our master, that they may provide for us." The authorities were paralyzed. They tried to pacify the workers with small amounts of pastry and promises, hoping they would return to the hills, but the men stayed. They moved from temple to temple, even threatening to block the paths to the royal tombs. For days, the high-stakes standoff continued. This was no longer a simple domestic dispute. It was a fundamental challenge to the Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. If the commoner could defy the state, then the state's aura of invincibility was broken. Eventually, the pressure worked. The grain was released from the temple stores, and the rations were paid. But the precedent had been set. The strike at Deir el-Medina revealed a hidden truth about the Egyptian empire. Its grandeur was built on a fragile foundation of human cooperation. The pharaoh might be a god, but his divinity was maintained by the hands of men who required bread and beer to function. The commoner had found his voice, not just through a prayer or a petition, but through the collective withdrawal of his labor. As we look at the breathtaking murals in the Valley of the Kings, we often see only the glory of the gods and the triumph of the kings. But the history of the strike reminds us to look at the walls differently. It shows us that the commoners were not just the passive backdrop of history. They were its active participants, capable of shaking the very pillars of the throne when the social contract was betrayed. In the silence of the tombs, we finally hear the roar of the people who built them, proving that the most enduring monument of Egypt wasn't made of stone, but of the resilient spirit of the men who refused to be forgotten.
That resilient spirit was not merely forged in the heat of physical labor, but in the rigorous social order that governed every corner of the Nile Valley. To build such monuments, a society required more than just muscle. It required a system of truth that kept the peace when tempers flared under the baking sun. In a land where thousands of people lived in close quarters along a narrow strip of fertile green, friction was inevitable. To the ancient Egyptian, chaos was the ultimate enemy, a terrifying force called Isfet that threatened to swallow the world if not held back by the strict application of Ma'at. This was the divine principle of truth, balance, and cosmic justice. It was not a philosophical ideal discussed only by priests in high temples. It was the bedrock of every transaction, every boundary line, and every heated argument in the village square. The physical maintenance of this order fell to a specialized group known as the Medjay. Originally nomadic tribesmen from the southern deserts, these elite scouts evolved over centuries into a paramilitary force that served as the eyes and ears of the state. You would have seen them patrolling the outskirts of the workers' villages, their presence a silent reminder that the pharaoh's reach extended far beyond the palace walls. They guarded the royal tombs against plunderers and kept watch over the granaries. Yet, for the average laborer, the Medjay were a distant authority. Most crimes, such as the theft of a copper chisel, disputes over an inheritance of goats, or the public insult of a neighbor, were handled much closer to home. Justice for the commoner was found in the Kenbet, the local council of elders. These were not professional judges or lawyers, but respected members of the community, local overseers, scribes, or even skilled craftsmen who understood the delicate rhythms of the village. There were no hushed courtrooms or mahogany benches. Instead, the Kenbet met in the open air, often at the gates of a temple or in a shaded plaza where everyone could watch. Here, the law was a living, breathing conversation. An accuser would stand before his peers and speak his truth directly. The goal was rarely just punishment, it was the restoration of balance. In a village where you had to work alongside your rival the very next morning, a resolution that left both parties feeling heard was more valuable than a harsh sentence that bred long-term resentment. The proceedings were often centered around the taking of oaths. To swear by the life of the pharaoh or the names of the gods was a heavy, terrifying act. A commoner knew that to lie under such an oath was to invite divine wrath, a spiritual weight far more frightening than a physical lashing. If a man was accused of stealing grain, he might be asked to swear his innocence before the local council. If he refused, his guilt was assumed.
If he lied and was later found out, the penalties were severe, ranging from 100 blows with a rod to the branding of his skin. Yet the Kenbet relied heavily on social pressure and the desire for one's name to remain pure in the eyes of their neighbors. But what happened when human testimony reached a dead end? What occurred when a thief was too clever or a witness too frightened to speak? This is where the boundaries between the legal and the supernatural evaporated entirely. In these moments, the community turned to the oracles. Imagine a festival day where the statue of a deified king or a local god is brought out from the sanctuary, carried on the shoulders of priests atop a portable wooden bark. As the god moved through the crowd, a villager could approach the divine image with a specific grievance. They might place 2 pieces of papyrus or 2 shards of pottery on the ground, each inscribed with a different outcome. The petitioner would ask a direct question, and the answer would come through the movement of the priests. If the bark tipped forward or seemed to lean toward one of the shards, it was seen as the nod of the god. To the modern eye, it looks like a performance, a way for the priests to subconsciously or even consciously manipulate the outcome. But to the Egyptian commoner, it was the absolute court of appeals. The god had spoken, and against the divine will, there was no further argument. This unique blend of community oversight and religious theater ensured that the law was never an abstract concept. It was in the wind that blew off the desert, in the shadow of the temple walls, and in the eyes of every neighbor who sat on the Kenbet. They lived under the constant, watchful gaze of a justice that was as old as the Nile itself. The Egyptian commoner understood that their world was fragile, held together only by the integrity of their word and the fear of the gods. In this way, the legal system was more than just a way to settle debts. It was a ritual that reaffirmed their place in a balanced universe. While their bodies might be broken by the labor of building for eternity, their society was protected by an invisible architecture of truth, proving that even in the absence of a modern police force, the light of Ma'at reached into the darkest corners of their humble lives. This constant striving for order meant that even the lowliest worker was part of something grander, a cosmic harmony that began on Earth and continued long after the final breath was drawn.
Yet this search for harmony was not merely a spiritual pursuit. It was a daily battle fought against the physical fragility of the flesh. While the pharaohs sought immortality through stone, the commoner fought for it through the preservation of health, navigating a landscape where the divine and the biological were perpetually intertwined. Life along the Nile was a paradox of abundance and hidden hazards. To understand the reality of ancient medicine, we must look beyond the monumental and into the microscopic. The primary witness to this struggle is a scroll of yellowed papyrus, nearly 20 meters long, discovered between the legs of a mummy in the Theban necropolis. This document, known as the Ebers Papyrus, serves as a medical encyclopedia for a world that saw no distinction between a virus and a curse. It reveals a society that was remarkably observant, yet deeply vulnerable to the elements they called home. The environment itself was a constant adversary. In the dry, sun-drenched valley, the very air was thick with the threat of blindness. Fine desert sand, lifted by the Khamsin winds, acted like microscopic glass, scouring the corneas of farmers and stonecutters alike. Trachoma and acute ophthalmia were so prevalent that they became a defining feature of the Egyptian face. The Ebers Papyrus lists dozens of remedies for what it calls the turning of the hairs into the eyes, prescribing ointments made of galena, copper, and even crushed lizard liver. The iconic black coal seen in tomb paintings was not merely a matter of vanity. This thick, lead-based paste served as a functional barrier, reflecting the sun's glare and acting as a mild antiseptic to keep the swarms of flies at bay. For a laborer, losing one's sight was a death sentence. A blind man could not sow the fields or pull the sledges of granite. While the sand attacked from above, the river presented a more insidious danger from below. The Nile was the source of all life, but its slow-moving irrigation canals were breeding grounds for the invisible.
Commoners who spent their days wading in the silt-heavy water for planting or washing were frequently invaded by parasitic worms. We see the evidence today in the calcified remains of ancient tissues, showing the devastating impact of schistosomiasis. The Egyptians recognized the symptoms, a slow wasting of the body and blood in the urine, though they did not understand the life cycle of the parasite. They called it the disease, attributing it to a poison introduced by a malevolent spirit. The Ebers Papyrus suggests various herbal purgatives to expel these internal demons, but for the majority of the population, chronic lethargy and organ failure were simply the price one paid for living beside the great river. The physical cost of building the dream of the pharaohs is written even more clearly in the bones of the workers. Excavations at the cemeteries of the pyramid builders reveal a population that lived under immense mechanical stress. Men and women died young, often in their 30s, their spines deformed by the constant pressure of hauling immense weights. The skeletal record shows a high frequency of osteoarthritis and degenerative disc disease. However, it also shows something surprising, a sophisticated understanding of trauma. We find femurs that were snapped in work accidents, but were set so perfectly that the bone knitted back together without a limp. We find skulls that survived trepanation, the deliberate cutting of the bone to relieve pressure. These were not the results of accidental healing, but of a structured medical profession that understood the mechanics of the human frame. The Egyptian pharmacy was a mixture of the kitchen and the garden. Honey was the cornerstone of their topical treatments. Without knowing the science of bacteria, they recognized that honey never spoiled and that wounds covered in it did not fester. They used it as a primary bandage for the gashes sustained in the quarries, often mixing it with lint and grease to create a primitive but effective antibiotic dressing. They understood the cooling properties of aloe for burns and the use of willow leaves containing the precursors to modern aspirin to dull the persistent ache of inflamed joints. When a worker suffered a compound fracture, the physician would use splints made of bark and wrapped in linen, soaked in resin to create a cast as hard as modern plaster. Yet for all their practical skill, the ancient mind could not conceive of a purely mechanical universe. To them, a fever was not just a rise in body temperature, it was an occupation. An invisible entity, perhaps a restless ghost or a minor deity, had taken up residence within the patient. Therefore, the cure required more than just honey and willow. It required the spoken word. The Ebers Papyrus is as much a book of spells as it is a medical text. A physician would stand over the afflicted, reciting incantations designed to command the demon to depart. They believed that names held power. By naming the sickness and identifying the spirit responsible, they could strip it of its influence. The healer functioned as a bridge between the physical and the metaphysical. While one hand applied a poultice of malachite to a festering sore, the other hand would be raised in a gesture of banishment. The incantations were rhythmic and firm, often invoking the power of Horus, the god who had his own eye torn out and miraculously restored. The patient was told that their suffering was part of a divine narrative, and that just as the gods had triumphed over injury, so too would the commoner triumph. This fusion of science and magic was not seen as a contradiction. It was a holistic approach to a terrifyingly unpredictable world. If the medicine failed, the magic might succeed. If the magic failed, it was simply because the cosmic order, the Ma'at, had decreed that the person's time on earth was at an end. For the silent majority, health was a fragile equilibrium. Every day was a negotiation with the sun, the water, and the heavy stones of the state. They lived with the constant presence of pain, treating it with what they had at hand, the plants of the riverbank, the minerals of the earth, and the ancient prayers of their ancestors. This struggle for survival was the true foundation upon which the pyramids were built. Before the first stone could be laid, the body had to be mended, the eyes had to be cleared, and the demons of the Nile had to be kept at bay. As we look at the remnants of their medical tools and the records of their recipes, we see a people who were not merely victims of their environment, but active, intelligent participants in the preservation of their own lives. They moved through their days with a stoic resilience, knowing that while the spirit might be eternal, the body required a constant, watchful defense. This preservation of the physical self was the first step in the journey toward the afterlife, ensuring that even the humblest worker could stand whole before the gods when their labor finally ceased.
But this hope for eternal life was not a luxury reserved for those who wore the double crown of Egypt. While the gilded masks of the kings command our attention today, the longing to survive death pulsed through every mud brick village and every dusty workshop along the Nile. We must peel back the layers of sand to see the democratization of the divine. For the majority of those who lived in the shadows of the monuments, the path to the stars was not paved with gold, but with decades of quiet preparation and careful saving. The myth that the afterlife was an exclusive club for the elite is one of the greatest misconceptions of the ancient world. In reality, the Egyptian commoner was obsessed with their own mortality, viewing death not as an end, but as a hurdle that could be cleared with enough foresight and a few well-placed spells. For a stonemason or a weaver, the cost of dying was often higher than the cost of living. Preparing for the end was a lifelong financial burden. Imagine a family living on the edge of subsistence, carefully setting aside a portion of their grain or a few copper rings every month, not for a better house or a larger herd, but for a box of wood and a few jars of natron. A simple coffin, often made of local sycamore or even recycled timber from old doors, could cost the equivalent of several months' wages. Yet they paid it. They paid it because to be buried without a container was to risk the integrity of the body, and a broken body meant a broken soul. The mummification process itself was tiered to fit every budget. While the nobility underwent a 70-day ritual involving the removal of organs and expensive imported resins, the commoner opted for the economy package. This often involved the simple injection of cedar oil to dissolve the internal organs, followed by a long soak in a bed of salt. For the very poorest, the desert itself was the embalmer. They were laid in shallow pits where the sun-scorched sand evaporated the moisture from their skin before decay could set in, naturally preserving them for the ages. It was a humble process, devoid of incense and chanting priests, but the result was the same: a physical anchor for the spirit to return to. Even the sacred texts, once the sole province of royalty, eventually became available to the masses. The collection of hymns and instructions we call the Book of the Dead was essentially a survival guide for the soul, a cheat sheet for the terrifying obstacles of the underworld. By the time of the New Kingdom, these were not just inscribed on tomb walls, they were mass-produced. Scribes worked in workshops, pre-writing scrolls of papyrus with standardized spells. They would leave a blank space at the end of each incantation where a buyer could have their own name inserted. A farmer could walk into a shop, choose a scroll that fit his budget, and buy his way into the secret knowledge of the gods. These scrolls were tucked into the linen wrappings of the deceased, providing them with the magic words needed to bypass the gatekeepers of the beyond. This accessibility created a profound sense of spiritual agency among the common people. They believed that if they lived a life of ma'at, of balance and justice, and if they could afford even a modest funeral, they stood just as much a chance of reaching paradise as the pharaoh himself. The Hall of Truth did not care for the weight of one's gold, only the weight of one's heart. This belief turned the struggle of daily life into a meaningful prelude. Every block hauled and every field plowed was done under the watchful eyes of ancestors who had already made the transition and who were waiting for them on the other side. The climax of this lifelong labor was the vision of the Field of Reeds. This was the Egyptian heaven, but it was not a place of idle clouds or ethereal light. To the commoner, paradise looked remarkably like the Nile Valley they knew, only perfected. It was a land of eternal harvest, where the wheat grew taller than a man's head, and the barley never failed. There were no droughts in the field of reeds, no tax collectors demanding a share of the crop, and no overseers with whips to drive the workers until their knees buckled. In this celestial landscape, the deceased would still work, for the Egyptians found dignity in labor. But the work was effortless, and the reward was absolute. They would sail on cool waters, sit under the shade of fruiting trees, and feast with the family members who had gone before them. The pain of the physical world, the cracked heels, the sore backs, and the hunger that gnawed during the lean years would be washed away. This was the great promise that kept the wheels of Egyptian society turning. The commoner did not build the pyramids out of a sense of slavery, but out of a shared cultural investment in a system that guaranteed them a place in this eternal garden. When we look at the small, cramped cemeteries of the workers at Deir el-Medina or the common graves at Giza, we aren't just looking at the remnants of the poor. We are looking at the remnants of a deep collective hope. These people spent their lives in the service of a grand architecture, but their true focus was on the architecture of their own eternity. They saved their copper, they bought their scrolls, and dried their bodies in the salt, all for the chance to stand before the scales of Osiris and claim their right to a field of gold. For the Egyptian commoner, death was the ultimate equalizer, the moment that the heavy shadow of the pyramid lifted, revealing a sun that would never set on their labor. The silence of their lives was not a sign of insignificance, but a testament to a quiet, enduring faith that the best of life was yet to come.
That faith, though enduring, was about to meet a horizon it could no longer recognize. For 3,000 years, the commoner's life had been a closed circle, a sacred rhythm protected by the vastness of the desert and the regularity of the flood. But the world was growing larger and louder, and the silence of the Egyptian village was finally broken by the arrival of the Mediterranean powers. When Alexander and his successors took the throne, they brought more than just new tax collectors. They brought a slow, creeping transformation of the very ground the Egyptian walked upon. At first, the villages looked much as they always had, the mud brick walls still cooling the midday heat, but the language in the marketplace began to shift. The ancient sounds of the ancestors started to mingle with the sharp, rhythmic cadence of Greek. It wasn't a sudden break, but a gradual fading, like the colors of a wall painting left too long in the unforgiving sun. As the Roman eagles eventually replaced the Macedonian spears, the pressure on the commoner's identity intensified. The old gods, those animal-headed guardians of the harvest and the hearth, were no longer the sole keepers of the afterlife. New temples rose, blending Egyptian forms with foreign aesthetics, but the spirit within them was moving elsewhere. The farmer who once prayed to Osiris for a bountiful flood now found his world reshaped by administrative demands from distant cities across the sea. The distinctiveness of being Egyptian, of that specific, singular way of seeing the cosmos as a mirror of the Nile, began to blur into a broader, more generic existence. The sacred scripts, once the secret language of the soul, were relegated to a shrinking priesthood before eventually being silenced by the rise of a new faith that had no room for the old pantheon. The loss of the ancient tongue was perhaps the quietest tragedy of all. When the commoner stopped speaking the language of their fathers, they lost the keys to their own history. The myths that had explained the stars and the seasons became echoes, then whispers, and finally a profound silence. Christianity swept through the delta and the valley, offering a different kind of hope, but one that required the burial of the old ways. The rituals of mummification and the focus on the physical preservation of the body began to seem like relics of a misunderstood past. The commoner was no longer a child of the sun god, but a subject of a world-spanning empire, their identity submerged under layers of foreign law and new theology. While the great stone temples of the pharaohs stood defiant against the centuries, the world of the ordinary person possessed no such permanence.
Their homes were made of the earth itself, sun-dried bricks formed from the very silt the river provided. These villages were living things, constantly being repaired and rebuilt, but once the ancestral chain was broken and the populations moved or dwindled, they were abandoned to the elements. Without the constant care of the families who inhabited them, the houses began to sag. The rain and the seasonal dampness of the soil worked their way into the foundations. Walls that had witnessed centuries of births, meals, and prayers slowly crumbled. There is a stark contrast in what remains of this civilization. We know the names of kings because they carved them in granite, but the millions who fed those kings left almost nothing behind. Their domestic lives dissolved back into the mud from which they were born. The Nile, which had given them life, eventually reclaimed their shelters. The straw and the clay separated, washing back into the floodplains, enriching the soil for future generations who would have no memory of those who came before. Today, where a bustling village of weavers and potters once stood, there might only be a slight rise in the field, a subtle mound of gray earth that most would pass without a second thought. The silent life of the commoner didn't end with a grand collapse. It simply returned to the river, leaving us to search for their shadows in the dust of the valley.
Yet those shadows are not as elusive as they seem, for they have never truly left the valley floor. If we look closely at the riverbanks today, the ancient world begins to take shape once more, breathing through the lungs of the present. As the morning mist clings to the surface of the Nile, the air carries a familiar scent, the heavy, sweet aroma of wet silt and ripening grain that has sustained life here for more than 50 centuries. The dust of the valley does not just hold the secrets of the dead, it nourishes the living. If you watch a farmer, a member of the modern fellahin, as he moves through the emerald fields at dawn, you are witnessing a performance that has been staged every single day since the time of the first kings. His hands, calloused and darkened by the constant embrace of the earth, grip a wooden plow with a shape and weight that would have been immediately recognizable to an architect of the Old Kingdom. There is no grand machinery required for this ancient dialogue, only the steady weight of the human body against the resistance of the soil. The tools themselves are living echoes. Observe the shaduf, that simple counterweighted lever used to lift water from the river's edge into the parched irrigation channels. It swings with the same rhythmic creak it possessed when the Great Pyramid was still a fresh, gleaming white monument on the horizon. This is the true legacy of the Egyptian commoner, not a structure that stands apart from the world, but a way of being that is woven into the very landscape itself. These people did not seek to conquer the river or bend the environment to a static will. They learned to dance with its floods, to wait patiently for its retreat, and to place their absolute trust in the gift of the mud. While the kings and queens of old sought to preserve their names in the cold silence of granite and limestone, the people who actually built the foundations of this civilization found a different path to eternity. The pharaohs feared the fading of memory, building ever larger mountains of stone to ensure they would never be erased from the record of time. Yet even stone eventually weathers, and names are slowly scrubbed away by the relentless desert wind. The commoner's immortality is more subtle and perhaps far more enduring. It lives on in the specific tilt of a head during a moment of rest, in the shared meal enjoyed under the deep shade of a sycamore tree, and in the quiet resilience required to survive another season of blistering heat and physical toil. Their lives were not defined by the grand movements of empires or the complex hidden theology of the priesthood. Instead, they were defined by the simple, profound acts of human experience that connect every generation. They loved with a fierce devotion to the family unit,
They worried over the health of their livestock during the lean months, and they celebrated the first green shoots of the harvest with a visceral joy that remains unchanged by the passing of thousands of years. We find them not in the gold leaf of the museums, but in the enduring spirit of the Egyptian countryside, where the past and the present are not two separate eras, but a single flowing current. The silence of the commoner is not an absence of history. It is a different kind of record altogether. It is a record written in the persistence of life itself. As the shadows lengthen and the river turns to a liquid gold under the soft glow of twilight, we realize that the pyramids were never the true heart of this land. The heart was always here, in the dirt, in the sweat, and in the quiet determination of those who simply lived. Their story is our story, a testament to the fact that to work, to love, and to survive is the greatest monument any human can leave behind. This has been a journey into the quiet strength of the forgotten. I am your narrator, signing off for Somnolent. May your rest be as deep as the ancient silt, and your dreams as enduring as the river's flow.